I want to introduce a very special member of the Alden Kindred, Jonathan Lane, who also happens to be the executive director of Revolution 250. And we are in for a treat. So we, of course, now, we're very familiar with our wonderful John and Priscilla Alden Pilgrims story. We're going to jump 150 years now, and we can start right here at the Alden House, where Jonathan is going to share with us the story of the Aldens who took up the cause of liberty and helped shape the future of a new nation. Jonathan is a long-serving public historian. He's done it all, you all. He's been an interpreter at Plymouth Patuxent, a historian with the Massachusetts Historical Society, even a reenactor in the Civil War, so he goes up and down. He's an expert researcher, genealogist, historian, and a wonderful storyteller. You're in for a real treat. And I'd like to also add, as we talked about when we did the lineage this morning, he's our lone descendant of John Jr. here today. Welcome, Jonathan.
Actually, I have 3 Alden ancestors, which I guess makes me slightly inbred. But who isn't these days, right? Good afternoon, cousins. How are you today? Everybody good? Okay. So thank you, Desiree, for the lovely introduction. So as she said, I'm executive director of Revolution 250. And for those of you who are not familiar, Revolution 250 is a private 501c3. We are a consortium of more than 75 organizations, including the Alden Kindred, who are working on the 250th anniversary of the revolution here in Massachusetts. And really, I mean, to be fair, it's Massachusetts and beyond. We coordinate and collaborate with organizations really all throughout New England because the New England story is fairly cohesive together. We also work with America 250. I'm just back from a national convening of America 250. And so if you have questions about the 250th as we move along, I'd be delighted to answer those as well. I started with this. Well, Revolution 250 was loosely founded in 2015 when they commemorated the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Sons of Liberty and the christening of the Liberty Tree. And I joined in 2017 just in time to protest the arrival of the customs commissioners. It may not sound like an exciting event. It was called The Devil and the Crown, but it really was. We think about what these people were protesting 250 years ago, and it's not just all about, tea and quartering soldiers and things like that. In this particular case, they were concerned about the expansion of English bureaucracy into the colonies. And we all love bureaucracy, right? That's what we stand up for here. Okay. There you go. Sorry, fine, take that woman's name. Anyway, so Revolution 250, we're a partnership organization. We've done, we did the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, Lexington and Concord, Bunker, all the big events. But really what makes my heart sing on a weekly basis are the hundreds of small events that are done in communities all across Massachusetts. Because if you remember your John Adams, and of course, which of us doesn't? I read him nightly, of course. John Adams famously said that if you want to know the history of the American Revolution, don't read histories of the American Revolution. First of all, they probably don't mention John Adams enough. And secondly, he believed that the real story of the revolution was what occurred in people's hearts and minds really the 10 years before Lexington and Concord. So he says, read the records from the committees of correspondence. Read the town meeting records. That's where the real revolution occurs. And, one of the things that founders frequently talk about is that their forefathers, the ones who settled here in 1620, and they settled in Boston sometime later. I'm not sure. Anyway, they they talk about their forefathers as being the bringers of liberty. And they believe that the English were the most free people in the world. Here in Massachusetts, it's worth noting a couple of things. First of all, population in Boston is about 16,000 people, half of whom are under the age of 17. Yeah. In Massachusetts, there's about 200,000 citizens, and half of those are under the age of 17. So it's a very young society, and this is the nature, right? The people coming over, they're having lots of children. Why are they having lots of children? Well, it's not just the fact they didn't have Netflix or things like that. It's these are your profit margin. These are your laborers. They add value to the family farm or the family business, whatever it may be. And the parents' duty, of course, is to raise them up in the right ideals of religion and liberty. And so this is really what this story today is all about. Now, how many children did John and Priscilla have? 10. They had 10 children. How many grandchildren did they have? And by the time you get to the Revolution, which, depending upon, birth order and so many other criteria, you're talking somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 people who are of age during the American Revolution. And it's not just here in Duxbury, although we have our Duxbury stories to tell as well. There were Alden descendants already in Pennsylvania by 1775. And probably some even further west that I didn't even get into. And so I want to thank the opportunity to come and talk to you about this today. And it was a real interesting exercise for me because as a lifelong genealogist, we spend our days trying to trace our family backwards. For this lecture, it was very much about tracing the genealogy forwards. And that's a lot harder than you think. Anyway, but there's some great stories to talk about. This is a very wordy page, and it's a terrible slide, and I apologize. But these are all quotes from town meetings, town meeting records. So I have one from Norton, Gorham, Maine, Abington, Leicester, Plymouth. Plymouth is not really town meeting record. It was actually a petition to the selectmen, and Wrentham. So we have our Wrentham friends there in the mid. So this is for you. And, so I'll just read the Wrentham one because it's right here in front of me. That it is of the opinion of this town that when our forefathers transplanted themselves and their estates into this then howling wilderness, entered into society with the crown of Great Britain, they had no such idea of the supremacy of that parliament, but on the contrary, as by the compact will appear, they considered themselves and posterity as having a right to enjoy all the rights and privileges of natural and freeborn subjects of Great Britain, to all interests and purposes whatsoever, as if they and every of them had been born within the realm of England. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about the American Revolution. We're talking about, they believe in the English Constitution, which is not one document, but many, I'm sure you know. They're talking about their rights and liberties under that Constitution and how, as being part of the empire, they have the same rights as every other Englishman. And they find themselves in the 1760s and 1770s as losing some of those rights over time. It is also worth noting, by the way, and I just want to dispel one, the American people are not heavily taxed. The Americans, the colonists, whatever you want to refer to them as, they pay about 1 shilling per year. I take that back, excuse me. They pay about 1 shilling per year. The average person living in England is paying about £1 a year, or about 20 times what the people here in America are paying through taxes, duties, and other sorts of things like that. The other thing to note about people here in America is that there are far more people here in America who get to vote than do in England. We in Massachusetts, even in the 17th century, so the first town meeting that I know about that can actually be called a town meeting It happened in Marshfield in 1627. The first moderator was Edward Winslow. And they were there to discuss issues that were pertinent to the town. So who is going to be Hogreeve? Are there any Hogreeves in the room? I'm just, no Hogreeves. How about clam sheriffs? Are there any clam sheriffs? No? I love these old town things. Fence viewer has got to be one of my favorites. Mr. Alden, you're going to be a fence viewer this year. Make sure you do your duty. And so town meetings are a place where people can come together and discuss issues that are of importance to the town. And if you were a property owner in 1770 or thereabouts, if you were a property owner here in Massachusetts with an estate valued over 40 pounds, you were a voter. So what does 40 pounds mean? Well, depending on your trade, it could be a year's pay or 2 years' pay, depending upon. But if you owned a house, you had an estate over 40 pounds. So you were there voting. And one of the major changes we see during the Revolution is that they move away from that property requirement and they just say anybody over the age of 21. Because they knew they were sending these boys off to war. So they wanted to make sure everybody had a thing to say. So, of course, we're going to start with my favorite, John Adams, Alden descendant. You can see here through Ruth, he and I are cousins, which I'm very happy to say. It's although he probably, he probably would have objected to me, and he objected to a lot of people. Anyway, and this is, I wrote in the very center, this is what Ben Franklin said of him. He means well for his country, is always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses. And, that could be a description of me. We all know about John Adams' life, so I'm not going to dwell a whole lot upon this. And the question is, as we talk about these people, what sense did they know they were descended from John and Priscilla Alden? And that's a question we're probably not going to be able to answer. But it is interesting to see the impact of this one family, this one couple who go on to have 10 children, and how they influence the founding of a new nation, whether they intended that or not. So, of course, John is a Harvard grad. He writes articles under the pseudonym Humphrey Plowjogger, which just I love to distraction. He also used the pseudonym Massachusettensis. And he's famous for defending the British soldiers during the Boston Massacre trial. He's a representative to the General Court from Braintree. He's a delegate to the Continental Congress. He sat on 90 committees in the Continental Congress. Talk about overachieving. Commissioner to France, ambassador to the Dutch Republic. He's at the signing of the Treaty of Paris, ambassador to Great Britain, vice president, president, established the First Navy. He's an author, a farmer, and of course, married to the lovely Abigail Smith, who he abandons for large periods of their marriage while he goes off to try and secure American independence. Interestingly enough, I won't get too deep into it, but there's two portraits here of John Adams. One painted, we think, it's a pastel by Benjamin Blythe. And the other one painted by John Trumbull. Both of these artists are also Alden descendants. So we'll talk about Henry Bass. Of course, the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party was an amazing event, and really something that many of us, Mike and I, and so many people we know, were proud to be part of. Henry Bass is also an Alden descendant through Ruth. He's a grindstone merchant. He's a member of the Loyal Nine, which is one of those super secret committees that helped get the whole Sons of Liberty started. He's a member of the North End Caucus. I have a couple of other ancestors on the other side of the family who were members of the North End Caucus. It's really where the word caucus finds currency here in America, starting with this revolutionary story. So I love that as well. He testified at the trial of the British soldiers, which again, you think about that. You've got one cousin defending the British soldiers. You've got other cousins who are standing up. And did they know they were cousins? Or I love 18th century Massachusetts. It's just terrific. He's obviously a son of liberty. He's close friends with Sam Adams and Major Henry Melville, who is the grandfather of Herman Melville. He's a volunteer guard at the tea ships. Oh, yes, I will guard the ships. He's a member of the Committee of Inspection. He was drafted into the Boston Militia, but paid the required fine not to serve. So public service, if you were drafted or if you were elected to a position in town meeting, you better show up or they will fine you. So if you get elected hog reeve and you don't show up to do hog reeving stuff, whatever that is, they will fine you. And it's a great source of public funds. He's married twice, and he was half owner of the ship Belisarius, which I only included because for those of us who may have grown up in the 1980s and 90s, there was a production company called Belisarius. It was named after Donald Belisario, and I don't know, I thought it was funny. So I threw that in there for the Gen X people, okay? So let's talk about John Trumbull, painter. We know he was at the Battle of Bunker Hill. A childhood accident left him blind in one eye, which is interesting when you think of him as an artist. Turns out to be ADC, aide-de-camp to General George Washington. He's Deputy Adjutant General to General Horatio Gates. He resigns from the Continental Army in 1777. He goes to London, studies under Benjamin West. He paints 250 portraits in his lifetime. He painted George Washington from memory. I hate people like that. You know, it's just... John Trumbull was in London when John Andre was arrested. And he gets arrested in London. They're thinking maybe they will exchange him. He spent 7 months in Bridwell, which is in Tothill Fields. He was kicked out of Britain in 1781. Americans get kicked out of Britain all the time, right? And here's Trumbull, he's getting kicked out of Britain. And he returns to Britain, of course, after the Treaty of Paris to continue his artistic studies. And he, perhaps more than any other artist in American history, has shaped the way our history is told or viewed. So obviously he paints the delivering of the Declaration of Independence. There is some rumor that he painted John Adams. He and John Adams did not get along. And so there's a rumor that he painted John Adams as being sort of a shorter and more portly than he actually was, just out of spite. Obviously painted the famous death of Warren scene, painted the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. He's descended from Elizabeth Alden, so Elizabeth Alden descendants, there we go. So your cousin, John Trumbull. I'm going to take a minute here, and I'm going to bring the mood down a little bit. So I want to talk about Faith Trumbull Huntington. So John Trumbull, the painter, is the son of the governor of Connecticut, who's Jonathan Trumbull. And Jonathan Jr. would, of course, go on to become governor of Connecticut. It's like the Trumbull office for a while, right? Faith Trumbull Huntington is married to Jedediah Huntington. He was a colonel in the Connecticut militia who comes to the Battle of Bunker Hill. And Faith is, she's particularly concerned for her husband's welfare. And she is verging on a panic attack when her husband is writing her letters about the battle, the siege of Boston. So she convinces a girlfriend, the two of them come on up to Boston to see their respective husbands, and Faith arrives in Roxbury the morning of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And what she sees, what she experiences completely upsets her. And she becomes despondent. She's prone to these sort of black moods in her life. And 6 months later, she'd kill herself in a house of a stranger in Roxbury, Massachusetts, because she can't stand the uncertainty of her husband's existence on the battlefield. And I tell this story mostly not because it's a feel-good story of the year, but because it is a reminder that when we tell the story of the Revolution, we talk about valor, we talk about service, we talk about sacrifice. we don't talk about the sort of invisible victims of all that happened during that 8-long-year war. So keep faith in your thoughts and prayers. Deborah Sampson Gannett. Deborah Sampson, of course, one of the very few women to serve in the Army of the American Revolution. She signs on to the 4th Massachusetts Light Infantry Company as Robert Shurtleff. She served 17 months before being discovered to be a GIRL. She was wounded at the time. She, of course, gets honorably discharged. She had been serving as an aide or valet to an officer at the time, in addition to her other work. After the war, she marries Benjamin Gannett, and then beginning in 1802, she begins this widely publicized lecture tour of her experiences in the Army during the Revolution. Paul Revere was an acquaintance of hers. He actually wrote a letter in support of her application for a pension. She is the official heroine of Massachusetts, and she is an Alden descendant through Sarah Alden. Any Sarah Alden people here? So this is your cousin, Deborah Sampson, served honorably in the war. Of course, any talk about Aldens in the American, and I should have said when I started my talk, I should have said, I'm not going to get to everybody's favorite revolutionary story. And there's 5,000 possible stories here, and so I'm sure I'm going to miss somebody's favorite. I apologize in advance. So here's one that's a great-grandson of John Alden. This is Colonel Ichabod Alden. He's famously killed at the Cherry Valley Massacre out in the Mohawk Valley in 1778. The Massachusetts troops served in many places, all over the scope of the American Revolution. In the Mohawk Valley, or in this case in Cherry Valley, they were out there suppressing Tory farmers and rangers and indigenous people. He was sent out there. They were in Cherry Valley, built a small fortification. Ichabod had been with General John Thomas at the Siege of Boston, which means he was on the southern side of the siege, probably in Roxbury. He was at the Battle of Saratoga. And in November of 1778, he had led his company of men out to Cherry Valley, where they were stationed in a fortification that is now referred to as Fort Alden. They were surprised, overwhelmed by a group of Butler's Rangers and allied Iroquois warriors who not only killed everyone, but scalped them all. It is marked. You can go out to Cherry Valley. I was just out there last year to scope it out, and it's a remarkable story in that it sets off perhaps one of the most brutal campaigns against the indigenous peoples in the Mohawk Valley. The people were so outraged by what happened to Colonel Alden and his men that the following spring, General John Sullivan of New Hampshire, was sent out amongst the Iroquois, and essentially they laid waste to the Haudenosaunee homesteads, farms, villages, anything really they could get their hands on. And it's not a particularly it's not a moment to be particularly proud of, but it does talk about the cost of war. We had many indigenous allies, many more than you probably realize, but many of those who sided with the British paid a very heavy price. I was determined to make sure that we talked about people who weren't necessarily named Alden. And I knew, because Trumbull was from Connecticut, I knew there were a bunch of people out in Connecticut. And these are a few sort of tangential stories here. So Mary Fish is an Alden descendant from Elizabeth Alden. And she is living in Stonington, Connecticut. She's married to Gold Selleck Silliman, which is an interesting name. I'd like to know more about his life. Her husband gets captured by Tories from Long Island. They row across the Long Island Sound. They know Gold Selleck Silliman. He's a well-respected merchant in the area. They capture him and his son, and they take him back to Long Island Sound, where he is kept for a year until he's exchanged for a Tory leader that had been captured from Long Island. And that is essentially the war in Connecticut and Long Island. These cross Long Island Sound raids capturing people left and right. And Benjamin Silliman is the son. Of course, he's born in 1779. He's actually born, the mother, Mary Fish Silliman, who is the descendant from Elizabeth Alden, she goes to Fairfield to live with extended family. And while she's in Fairfield, giving birth to Benjamin Silliman, the British Army arrives and begin looting, pillaging, and burning, which is going to be the title of my book on the British Army. But they, what's interesting, and I just threw this in because I thought it was interesting. So Benjamin Silliman, of course, born in 1779 in the middle of a British raid, but he becomes the first professor of science at Yale. And he's credited with distilling petroleum for the first time. So think about that. An Alden descendant responsible for distilling petroleum upon which much of the world relies. And we won't bring up global warming. William Roger Alden, graduate of Yale, 1773, another aide-de-camp to General Nathaniel Greene, of course, who's famously from Rhode Island. And he goes to serve down in South Carolina. You can see his list here. He's, begins as a lieutenant and adjutant, works his way on up, eventually to major. And he studies law. He's a deputy secretary to the Continental Congress in 1785. He becomes chief clerk of the State Department in 1790. He's an early member of the American Antiquarian Society. Just a quick check. Who's heard of the American Antiquarian Society? All right, so better than usual. So for those of you who don't know, the American Antiquarian Society was founded in 1812 by Isaiah Thomas, who was a printer in Boston during the Revolution. He wrote a 2-volume history of printing that is still the standard of his printing history in America. And all of the materials that he collected for that 2-volume history is the basis of his collection at the American Antiquarian Society. Their goal is to collect one of everything printed in America before 1876. So if you have any of that stuff and you don't know where to put it, they'd be happy to take it off your hands. And when I say everything on paper, I mean everything. I tried to give them my grandmother's collection of matchbook covers, but apparently those are post-1876, so I know. He founded Allegheny College, and we keep coming back, and we'll get into this a little bit more in a couple of slides, but there is a strong streak of education through this family line. So he's a descendant of Jonathan Holland, and eventually, of course, he becomes ordnance storekeeper at West Point once West Point is established. A long, dedicated public servant, to be sure. Benjamin Chandler, and there's not much to say about him, I'm afraid, but an interesting story. He is originally from the Bridgewater area. He's an ironmonger. Bridgewater actually had a very thriving ironworks in the early colonial period. He moves to Teignmouth, Vermont. And during the Battle of Bennington in 1777, and he decides to go visit his 2 sons, Joseph and John, who are at the Battle of Bennington. And while there, the British arrive. And so he picks up a gun and goes off to stand with his sons. And of course, he's the one who's killed. So he's killed at Bennington, descendant of Jonathan Alden. There's a group of people who put this middle name Covey into the middle, and I have no idea where they get that name from. It doesn't show up in any of the public documents, but they seem very determined that he was Benjamin Covey Chandler. So that's for somebody else to sort out. The story of the Revolution is very much a story of family, and we do see brothers and cousins going off to war together. And so here's 3 such. These are all Clarks. They are descendant from Ruth. They're from Norton, Massachusetts. And I picked this out because my family lived in Norton, Massachusetts for the better part of 150 years. But they're born in Norton, but they're actually living in Connecticut during the war. And they all have various amounts of service. Some of them are working in hospitals. Some of them are volunteering as substitutes. Obviously, one of them comes to Providence during the Battle of Rhode Island in 1778. And again, it comes back to the reason I included these in particular is because we need to change how we think of service. Not everybody joins the Continental Army and stays in it for 8 years. And as a matter of fact, the vast majority of people who serve during the American Revolution are serving in short stints, particularly between planting and harvesting. If possible, if they have the wherewithal, they are buying substitutes. People, young men who can be spared or parents are tired and sick of. So they will hire these young men to go off in their place. And so you see all of that here in these Clark brothers, who are all together children of Seth Clark and Mary Wild, descended of Ruth Alden. We don't talk much about the Battle of Rhode Island here, which is really funny because Massachusetts, when we talk about the 250th, people keep asking me. When I first took the job, they used to ask me, so when is the 250th again? As if it's one day. And unless you're from Philadelphia, it's actually, there's a whole 8-year or more, a 20-year discussion to be had. Now I'm getting people who are asking me, so when is this over? Because they're tired of it. Mostly that's my wife. I'm afraid, But the service for most people is done in short chunks. Is the story, and it's militia service here, militia service there. The Battle of Rhode Island happens in 1778. Right, the war has moved to New York. It's moved to New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Nobody's talking about the war here. How many of you know the story of the Battle of Rhode Island? So very, very few. I mean, more of you knew the American Antiquarian Society than the Battle of Rhode Island, which is amazing to me. For me, the story of the Revolution, the story of Revolution 250 is not just about events that happen in Massachusetts. It's about stories that Massachusetts people made happen. And so for instance, Saratoga, 40% of the Continental Line at Saratoga, people from Massachusetts. 75% of the militia at Saratoga from Massachusetts. Battle of Rhode Island, 50% of the militia from Rhode Island, and 20% of the Continental Line from Massachusetts. So we don't talk about what's happening to our fellow citizens after the Declaration of Independence. So that's your job today, is to go back and get people to talk about it. This is really interesting. So I desperately tried to find Aldens who were loyalists, people who supported the crown, and that's hard. That's a very hard thing to find. I think I came around, but I couldn't confirm it. But I think I found one who did move to Halifax after the British departed on March 17th, 1776. But I didn't include him because I couldn't confirm it. I couldn't confirm that he was an Alden descendant. But here's two. So it's Abigail Willard marries Joseph Bridgham. She is a great-granddaughter of John and Priscilla through John Alden Jr. And she marries Major Joseph Goldthwaite. Goldthwaite is definitely a loyalist. And so she stays here. She's like, oh, you're going to support the king? See ya, honey. But she left Boston, so they lived in Boston. They were fairly prosperous. He's a merchant. They crossed the Winnesiment Ferry. The Winnesiment Ferry runs between Boston and Chelsea. She was arrested, taken under guard because she was married to a loyalist. So you can't just cross into Sons of Liberty territory and say, but I like you guys. No, she was investigated by the Provincial Congress at Watertown, and she was allowed to go and stay with her brother Joseph Bridgham at Rehoboth. Her husband was a French and Indian War officer. He left behind at least 3,000 pounds in property, which is a pretty significant chunk of change. His will, which was proved in London in 1778, left his fortune to his nieces and nephews, provided that none of them are rebels and have borne arm against their king. So that rules out almost everybody in America. I was thinking about trying to make a claim for that money if it's still available, but it doesn't seem like it. John Bridgham, a brother of Hannah, is a captain in the company of Theophilus Cotton's regiment. He served in the same regiment at the Siege of Boston. He fights in the 23rd Regiment of Foot under Colonel Bailey and serves for 1 month and 16 days at the Battle of Rhode Island. So he's one of those militiamen who ends up at the Battle of Rhode Island. So we'll talk about Benjamin Blythe for a minute, the other portrait artist who painted John and Abigail. The portraits that he painted of them, you can see Abigail Adams sort of top center here, were supposedly their wedding portraits. They're at the Massachusetts Historical Society. But there are Blythe portraits, or at least portraits that are attributed to Blythe, painted and existing all over the place. The Reverend George Whitfield is probably one of the greatest preachers of the 18th century. He dies here in Massachusetts just before the war. Dr. Ezekiel Hersey, of course, is a Hingham guy. And Blythe is a little bit of a mysterious figure. We don't really know much about him. We know he was born in Salem. His father is also Benjamin Blythe. His mother is Mary Laguerre or Legare, depending. I mean, again, people throw in these accent marks. You just why do we want to be French? I don't know. And then on up through Ruth Alden and John Bass. He paints, or these are mostly pastel works. He does a few oils, but he paints many of the most prominent people in society. He gets into a little legal trouble about 1780. And I tried going through the documents last night. It seems largely has to do with, so Blythe, one of the ways that he made money was he got involved in bonds. He would help provide bonds for people who were probate, they were going through probate, or bonds for privateers. And some of those didn't go amazingly well. And he gets into a bit of legal trouble about 1780-81, and he just sort of disappears from the record. We don't know where he goes or where he ends up. We're pretty sure by 1782 he's dead. But where? That's everybody's mystery. But he left behind this amazing historical record of art as a pastelist. My favorite name on the list today, names I should say, Zebedee. I wish I had seen this before I'd had children. I'm sure Lieutenant Zebedee Snell would be totally fine in the Navy. And Issachar and Ebenezer. Again, these are all brothers who are descended of Jonathan Alden. And what's interesting, so you have the two brothers who are here. They're still in the Plymouth area. They're both officers. One's an ensign, the other's a captain. One's in the 10th Company, the other's in the 7th Company. They're doing local militia work, local militia service. March to Providence, December 8th, 1776. They were going to stop the British from capturing Newport, or not. Mostly not, because the British did end up capturing Newport. Issachar obviously pays for a substitute, and that's, again, if you could afford it. These are all woodworkers. They're manufacturing all kinds of woodenware here in this area, except for Ebenezer. Ebenezer moves to Cummington, which is way out, in the hinterlands of Upper Worcester County or Hampden. I can't remember which. And he marches to Bennington on the 17th of August on the alarm. Of course, the Battle of Bennington was on the 12th of August, so he was a little late getting there, but I'm sure he was used as one of the guards to bring soldiers back from Bennington, and they marched. And the prisoner of war story is an interesting discussion, which we should have at another period, because in Duxbury during the Revolutionary War, there are prisoners of war here. And because well, my favorite story is about in 1776, just after the British leave, 5 warships come into, they're transport ships, so not heavily armed. They come in with 500 members of the 71st Regiment. The 71st Regiment, they're all Scots. And they all get captured. And now the people of Massachusetts have 500 very surly Scotsmen, and they have no prison for them. So what they do is they whack them up into groups of 10, 12, 15, and they send them out to communities. And they let them live amongst you. And your job is to feed and clothe them, and you'd get a stipend from the state for all this. And, if they were well behaved, they could go out into the community and do work and make a little extra money to help pay for clothing and things like that. That's fairly typical. And doubtless, that's part of the response. People like Issachar and Zebedee, they're also doing coastal watch. So coastal watch is huge in this part of Massachusetts, making sure, because the British are raiding for foodstuffs, they're raiding for timber. The most famous raid is when they raided Martha's Vineyard, and they carried away 10,000 sheep. 10,000 sheep. Think about that. One sheep will feed 50 soldiers. So they needed the meat. So I'm going to end with this one, and I'll take some questions. This was perhaps my most recent discovery, and perhaps one of my favorite discoveries. So you can see John Alden's son Zechariah to Mary, who marries Samuel Neeland Sr. Samuel Neeland Jr. marries Mary Waters. And Mary and Samuel Sr. have Daniel, John, and Samuel, and a couple of others. I just kept these 4 because these 4 are all and these aren't really even, Revolutionary War patriots particularly, but in the lead up, they're all printers. And they're all in the printer trades. So Samuel Sr. was a printer under the title Neeland and Green. Some of you may remember that the very first printer in Massachusetts was Samuel Green. And he had a press over at what's that college, that little college in Cambridge? Anyway, he's over in Cambridge and he's printing stuff. But he starts the Boston Gazette, which is the second newspaper in America. Anybody know what the first newspaper in America is? The Current. There you go. And he also prints the New England Weekly Journal, which is the 4th newspaper. So apparently he only printed even-numbered newspapers. I don't know what that's about. He's also, for those of us who have been involved in sort of Pilgrim 17th century history, he's also the first New England printer to print Robert Cushman's sermon. The sermon that Robert Cushman gave when he was here in 1623. Daniel Neeland and John Neeland work together. They're known as D and J Neeland. Very clever. I don't know how they came up with it. They print out of their father's shop in Hanover Street. They print about 90 titles. They print Isaac Watts. Isaac Watts is perhaps one of the greatest psalmists in the 18th century, so they print a lot of his work. They also get involved in probate bonding, which also gets them into trouble. There's a lesson to be learned here. Apparently, Alden descendants learned it very hard. But they also printed treasurer's notes and a variety of other things. There's Anne Neeland marries John Gill. And John Gill is a partner in perhaps one of the most well-known 18th century newspapers, the Boston Gazette, 1755 to 1775. They're printing currency that was designed by Paul Revere. They're printing broadsides and pamphlets by Mercy Otis Warren and all kinds of interesting works. And then Samuel Neeland Jr., who is also a printer. He is a Harvard student. 1743 is the year he graduated, and he takes over his father's end of the business in Neeland and Green, which eventually becomes just Samuel Neeland. Between the two of them, they print 3 out of every 4 books published in Boston from 1730 to 1755. And, we talked a little bit about how literate the society was here. And of course, literacy is extremely important to those who came over on the Mayflower. It's how we learn the Word of God through the publication of Scripture. It is illegal to print a Bible in English in America before 1776. There is a monopoly in England. Now, that being said, Samuel Neelan Sr. printed a Bible. And what he did was he put a London imprint on it. But it was printed here in America, but it says it was printed in London. And if that isn't the most American thing ever, I don't know what is. But yeah, it's 1751, 1752, depending upon the scholarship. I cannot undersell the importance of printing and literacy in the history of our American Revolution. It's not just about understanding our ideals and our rights and our liberties, but it's obviously the most effective way of communicating them. The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere is largely based upon the post riders that had been riding around New England, bringing these newspapers hither and yon to spread the word about what's happening in Boston. When you're talking about Committee of Correspondence Records, when you're talking about perfect example is in March of 1776, the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts, which is, the General Court essentially, but they couldn't call themselves the General Court. So the Provincial Congress asks every town in America, every town in Massachusetts, to debate independence and whether they would support independence. If the Continental Congress declares it, would they support it with their lives, their liberty, and their fortune? And they can't send out written notices enough. So what they do is they print the ask in the newspapers. And the towns are voting on whether or not they would support independence. We have answers from about 125 towns on whether they would support independence. And so far it's 123 to 0-2. 2 towns abstained. Barnstable was one of them. Hubbardton was another, and Hubbardton was the home of Timothy Ruggles. And for those of you who don't know the Timothy Ruggles story for another time. Boston had more newspapers than any other community leading up to the Revolution. Philadelphia passes them in 1775. And it would fluctuate back and forth for a while. It's a very, for the 18th century, I would even say a hyper-literate society. And it's because of descendants of John and Priscilla Alden. I'd be happy to take your questions. I should have said I just saw my notes on the bottom of the slide, which I couldn't see while I was looking at the slideshow. Anne Gill's husband, Anne Neeland Gill, her husband John Gill, was imprisoned for 30 days for printing treason, sedition, and rebellion. Huzzah. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Did the Scottish POWs go back to England?
Not all of them. Some did. The best example I know, because I know the story's been completely documented, is out in South Hadley, Massachusetts. There's a home there called the Porter Phelps Huntington House, which I recommend you all go see. And again, it's all about going out and seeing what these towns are doing. But they are a site of enslavement. But they are also a place where some of these Scottish prisoners of war were kept, including one by the name of course, now I'm not going to remember what his name is. Anyway, give me a minute. But he was kept as a prisoner of war there. He was from outside of Glasgow. He was a gardener by trade, and so what he did for the family was he worked on their garden and developed this very formal garden for the homestead. And he is buried in South Hadley, and his headstone was paid for by the people of the town. And on it says, whatever his name is, It doesn't say that, but a member of His Majesty's 71st Regiment lived his entire life in South Hadley. And you see a lot of that. After guys are captured at Bennington and Saratoga and kept as prisoners of war. So the very first prisoner of war camp ever built in America was built in Rutland, Massachusetts for the captured soldiers of Saratoga. And there's nothing left of it, of course. It was probably hastily built. It does result in one of the great murder cases of the 18th century. So I talked about Mr. Ruggles from Hubbardston. Well, his daughter, Bathsheba Ruggles Spooner, is living in Rutland, and she gets to know a couple of soldiers who are in the prisoner of war camp, and she convinces them to murder her husband and throw him down the well, and for which she is tried and convicted of murder and hanged, even though she pled she was pregnant, which, in fact, she was. Yes, sir.
We have some questions from the outstations. So first question was, who fired the first shot at Lexington, followed by, were there any Aldens at Lexington?
Oh, that's an excellent question. None that I've come across at the moment, but I should have looked at that. Who fired the first? Well, look, the British fired the first shot. Let's be real. I mean, come on. I mean, they can say nobody knows, but I'm blaming the British. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay. In Stony Point, New York, Alden fought at the battlefield of Stony Point in 1779. And you guys did a presentation that I watched on Zoom, but I can't remember which Alden.
I don't know off the top of my head, but I will find out for you. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Is there anything more you can tell us about Timothy Ruggles?
You know, it's really interesting. I love Timothy Ruggles as a character. He's a horrible, petty man, but he was literally one of the first great military heroes of the 18th century in Massachusetts. He was a commanding officer of a ranger company in the French and Indian Wars. He taught ranger tactics to so many men throughout New England. And actually, during the Stamp Act crisis in 1765, he's chosen not only to be a delegate of the Stamp Act crisis, he is chosen to be essentially the president of the Stamp Act Congress. Some scholars believe that that the whole thing was engineered by Hutchinson because he knew Ruggles was favorable towards the crown, and he didn't want any embarrassing declarations coming out of the Stamp Act Congress. And as a result, Ruggles actually did not sign the resolves of the Stamp Act Congress in 1765, but it really set his seal. And I don't want to say anything, but Ruggles was actually born in Barnstable. And I'm not going to say that contributed to their answer in 1776 on the Declaration of Independence. They had other problems going on in town. But, it's interesting that there is that connection, that he was originally from Barnstable, and then he moves out to Hubbardston, and he gathers loyalists around him because they know his political predilections. Anything else?
Yep,
Yes, sir.
We had another question from the outstations asking if you could talk about Penobscot and were there Aldens there?
I have no doubt that there were Aldens at Penobscot. I will have to do some digging to figure out which ones were there. So for those of you who aren't aware, the fight at Penobscot was not Massachusetts' most shining moment. As a matter of fact, Paul Revere would be court-martialed for his behavior at the Battle of Penobscot, for which he was acquitted. But Massachusetts had their own navy at that point. We had 5 ships. 2 had been built in Swansea, 1 had been built in Bedford, 1 in Kingston, the Independence. I'm sure many of you know that story. And 1 up in, I think it's Newburyport was the last one. and they were all captured at Penobscot, except for the Rising Republic. And the Rising Republic was not at Penobscot because she couldn't sail without taking on water. She was really well built. So they used her actually as a prison hulk in Boston Harbor to keep British and German prisoners of war. And which I have to admit, when I learned that, that was the first time I ever knew that Massachusetts had a prison hulk in Boston Harbor. So there's obviously lots more to be dug out. So essentially it was just an assault on a British position, and it did not go amazingly well for the people of Massachusetts. And much of the force was forced to surrender. Some made their escape through the woods and wilderness.
Thanks to their great commander of artillery in Massachusetts.
Yes, Paul Revere, we know. He's a wonderful guy. Mike, for those of you who don't know, Mike also portrays Paul Revere for the Revere House in Boston and nationally, I think, at this point.
So one of the Alden sons was at Penobscot.
Ah, which one?
Yes, Samuel.
Oh, okay.
Samuel, son of Briggs. I'm so sorry.
I know. Not our shining moment.
Not our shining moment.
No, and he died there. So very sad.
No, but again, it is an important reminder that it's not all about Saratoga and Monmouth and Brandywine. It is about Penobscot. It is about the Battle of Rhode Island. It is about the raid on New Bedford, which crippled the town for a generation. They lost 80 ships and all of the shipping facilities in 1778 due to a British raid. They landed 4,000 men in one day. Marched them up to the head of the Acushnet River, burning as they went, marched across the Acushnet River, down the other side into what is now Fairhaven, burning as they went, and they destroyed the Aiken shipyard over in Padenham. And then, of course, they go off and they go to whatever the sheep festival was happening in Martha's Vineyard. They go there next.
So Roger Alden and our Connecticut friends was very good friends with Nathan Hale from Connecticut, the state hero. And Roger Alden, apparently his father was named John Alden. Mother was Elizabeth, and his father died young. And so Elizabeth raised him and put him through Yale in 1773 as a tavern keeper
Interesting.
in Lebanon, Connecticut. Colleen, I remember we researched that. That was a good story.
Roger Alden's famous quote, "I regret I have but one friend to give to my country."
Very good, Jonathan.
I should have started with, I do have a very strange sense of humor when it comes to history. I'm very proud of what the people accomplished, but I try and remind ourselves that, they're just people and they live. It's that famous quote, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thank you.